May 16, 1940, Washington, D.C. The late afternoon humidity clings to the White House walls. A cluster of cameras and news microphones point toward a man who knows the world is approaching a precipice. Franklin Delano Roosevelt adjusts his glasses, the ink on his prepared notes barely dry. Europe is burning. Nazi panzers roar across France, and no one can say whether Britain will survive what comes next. FDR's voice is steady, every word measured. The United States, he declares, will build 50,000 warplanes, a number so immense it feels like a challenge hurled at fate itself. Journalists scribble furiously, but some pause, exchanging looks. America barely produced a few thousand a year. The factory floors feel small. Tooling is outdated. Military aviation is a niche, not a colossus. Thousands of miles away, German officials listen with amusement. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring lets out a booming laugh. The Luftwaffe commander believes his air force is unmatched, his industrial base unchallenged. The Americans, in his mind, are dreamers, soft, divided, and far too late. But Roosevelt isn't issuing a boast. He is laying down a promise, and fulfilling that promise will reshape the entire world, because this moment is only the ignition. In 1940, the world stood at a crossroads. The promises made after the First World War, never again, disarmament, a stable peace, had evaporated in the smoke trailing behind German dive bombers. Adolf Hitler's regime had mastered a new tempo of war. Blitzkrieg, armored spearheads, mechanized infantry, and aggressive air power striking faster than defenders could react. Nations that looked formidable on paper were collapsing in weeks. Poland had fallen in a month, Norway in just 2 months. Now France, the military giant of Europe, was teetering on the edge. The Luftwaffe soared above the battlefield, Heinkel bombers and Messerschmitt fighters sweeping skies clean. German pilots felt invincible. Propaganda posters boasted that the skies belonged to them now, and would forever. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched in uneasy silence. The scars of the Great Depression hadn't fully healed. Isolationist sentiment surged through Congress and the public. Many Americans believed the oceans would shield them from war's reach. Aviation production. It was modest at best. A fragmented industry producing civilian aircraft, mail carriers, and a handful of military prototypes. In 1939, America manufactured fewer than 3,000 warplanes. To call for more than 16 times that number seemed unrealistic. Even within the military, there were skeptics. The Army Air Corps was small and underfunded. The Navy had carriers but limited aircraft to fill their decks. The tools of air power were still in their adolescence. Teething issues in engines, stressed airframes, unreliable radios, rapidly evolving designs. Airplanes were still largely handcrafted machines. A workforce trained for mass precision production did not yet exist. Factories were scattered. Boeing in Seattle, Douglas in Santa Monica, Grumman on Long Island, Lockheed in Burbank, each producing slowly, cautiously, like artisans rather than industrial war makers. Tool and die sets were expensive. Machine tools were limited. Aluminum was not yet a controlled strategic material. Most importantly, the United States lacked organization for war. Hitler and Göring were convinced America couldn't change fast enough. Göring's swagger was rooted in real numbers. In 1939, Germany boasted one of the largest, most technologically advanced air forces in the world. Their pilots were combat-hardened from Spain and Poland. Their assembly lines had been humming. Since 1933, producing fighters like the Bf-109 in serious quantities. In contrast, American assembly lines made Buicks, Fords, refrigerators, not bombers, but speed, in war production, isn't a matter of experience. It's a matter of will and scale. Roosevelt understood something Göring did not. American factories were slumbering giants. Beneath the civilian consumer economy lay a capacity unlike anything Europe could rival. Corporations that could produce cars by the millions could produce aircraft, if given a reason, and enough pressure. Still, in mid-1940, That transformation looked distant. The US military was a fraction of what it would become. The Army ranked 18th in the world, behind Portugal. Naval aviation programs strained for budget scraps. Pilots trained in aging biplanes while new monoplane designs struggled to reach maturity. Factories lacked standardized parts. Each aircraft often differed slightly from the last. Craftsmanship was admirable. Efficiency was not. Exporting aircraft to Britain helped keep companies alive, but demands were inconsistent and funding unpredictable. Then the fall of France in June 1940 cracked American illusions wide open. Isolationism suddenly felt like wishful thinking. Congress, once cautious, opened its wallet. Defense budgets surged, recruiting offices filled, and production contracts flooded the desks of aircraft CEOs. Roosevelt's May proclamation for 50,000 planes had seemed ambitious. By autumn, it felt necessary. This wasn't just about helping Britain survive the looming storm of the Battle of Britain. It was about preparing for the possibility that the United States might soon stand alone with democracy's fate in its hands. The U.S. aircraft industry began a transformation unlike anything in industrial history. Engineers redrew designs, tooling orders spiked, factories expanded, and a new partnership formed between the military, government planners, and America's industrial titans. It would take time, years, before the numbers matched Roosevelt's vision. But the first sparks of the coming production inferno were now visible. And soon, a new phrase would define the next phase of mobilization, a phrase that would take the promise of those 50,000 planes and turn it into something far greater and far more formidable. The arsenal of democracy was rising, and the world was about to learn what American industry could become when pushed to its limits. By late 1940, the urgency was unmistakable. Britain was holding on after the Battle of Britain, but only just. Luftwaffe raids pounded London and industrial cities every night. Winston Churchill kept one eye on radar screens and the other fixed on American manufacturing reports. British factories were strained, their skies under siege, their supply lines vulnerable. If Britain fell, Nazi Germany would command the entire European coastline. The Atlantic would become a battleground, and the United States, still officially neutral, would suddenly find Hitler just a few thousand miles from New York. Franklin. Roosevelt recognized that the arsenal could no longer remain metaphorical. Industry needed leadership. Absolute leadership. In January 1942, the War Production Board, WPB, was created to coordinate materials, standardize output, and turn competing corporations into collaborators against a single enemy. But the mobilization started before Pearl Harbor with monumental decisions that reshaped the industrial map of America. Civilian production began to bend toward war. Companies famous for automobiles, appliances, and household goods now received orders for engines, airframes, landing gears, and propellers. Procurement officers demanded scale, standardization, and speed. This transformation required new factories on a staggering scale, often built in open fields far from the coasts. Huge plants rose like steel cathedrals. Willow Run, Michigan. Ford's attempt to build B-24 Liberators on a moving assembly line. Boeing Plant 2, Seattle, expanding to churn out B-17 Flying Fortresses. Consolidated, San Diego and Fort Worth, extending the B-24 production network. Douglas, Santa Monica, and Tulsa, multiplying C-47 and SBD output. North American Aviation, Inglewood and Dallas, home to the P-51 Mustang, Republic, Farmingdale, P-47, Thunderbolt in staggering quantities, Lockheed, Burbank, P-38, Lightning, Specialized and Deadly, Grumman, Bethpage, Carrier. Fighters for a war still to come in the Pacific entire regions, transformed from farmland into industrial powerhouses. But buildings alone could not win a war. Airplanes needed engines, thousands of them every month. So the Wright and Pratt & Whitney plants grew, their radial engines becoming the beating hearts of Allied fleets. Machine tools, the unsung heroes of manufacturing, became the new gold. The WPB rationed steel, and allocated cutting machines to factories that demonstrated they could produce fast and produce right. Aluminum production skyrocketed. New smelters lit up the Rockies and Pacific Northwest, powered by hydroelectric projects once built for the New Deal. Rubber, cut off from Asian supply, was replaced by synthetic alternatives invented in frantic bursts of chemistry. Most critically, the workforce exploded. Millions poured into factory towns, farmers leaving dust-stung fields. African. Americans seeking opportunity in the Great Migration's next wave. Women stepping into roles barred to them only years before. They learned to rivet, weld, inspect, and assemble with astonishing speed. Training schools and vocational centers multiplied. New labor management deals balanced speed with safety, though strikes and tensions still flared under pressure. Standardization swept through design philosophy. Gone were the days when each aircraft was a unique creation. Subcontractors built uniform components, wings here, fuselages there, engines elsewhere, all converging on final assembly lines. Engineers adjusted blueprints to simplify parts. Defects dropped, output rose. Aircraft that once took months to build could now be completed in days. Still, Göring and Germany remained confident. The Luftwaffe believed that quality, experience, and early war dominance would outweigh mass production. Their aircraft factories, bombed but resilient, kept turning out Bf-109s and FW-190s. German pilots remained some of the best in the world, but beneath the statistics, a structural difference grew wider every month. Germany was fighting a war while still trying to build production capacity. America was building capacity before entering the war. By the end of 1941, a shift in global power was beginning, one that would be unleashed fully after. Pearl Harbor triggered all restraints to fall away. The arsenal of democracy wasn't just a catchy phrase anymore. It was becoming the single most significant advantage the Allies would possess. And soon, its impact would be measured not just in factories and contracts, but in the lives of those who made the planes, flew them, and faced them in battle, on both sides of the war. That is where the human and technological story emerges, and where the next angles of this epic transformation take center stage. The human workforce before the war. Aircraft workers were specialists, machinists who crafted one plane at a time with patient precision. But wartime mobilization democratized production. Suddenly, millions of ordinary Americans were handed tools and roles they never imagined. By 1943, factories ran 24 hours a day under blazing lights. Shifts rotated. Days, nights, graveyard, leaving clocks meaningless. Cafeterias served thousands. Buses transported workers from towns hastily built around plants like Willow Run. People lived by whistles, clocks, and quotas. Women, once discouraged from physical labor, stepped up. Rosie the Riveter was not just a poster. She was every woman who tightened bolts on a B-24 wing, who calibrated bomb sights, who checked a rivet row with calloused fingers. At the peak, almost one-third of the aviation workforce were women. African-American workers entered previously closed industries. War necessity forced slow but real integration, sometimes resisted, always essential. Detroit, Los Angeles, Seattle all saw demographic shifts that would echo into the civil rights movement. They bore the burden of urgency. Every bomber unfinished meant crews flying missions with fewer escorts. Every engine delay echoed in distant skies. The pride was real, not from propaganda, but from knowing that each rivet might defend a pilot thousands of miles away. Behind every aircraft number was a human fingerprint, literal and metaphorical. Engineering and production technology. The American advantage was not merely manpower, it was the science of scale. Aircraft manufacturing initially resisted automation. Designs changed too fast. Craftsmen insisted machines lacked the finesse needed. But time forced innovation. Engineers reimagined the process. Jigs aligned vast wing structures with mathematical precision. Moving assembly lines, Ford's signature, adapted for bombers. Modular construction allowed distant plants to build interchangeable parts. Tool standardization ensured any mechanic could repair any plane anywhere. The result was an exponential learning curve. The more aircraft built, the faster and better the next one emerged. Engine development surged. The Wright R-2600 powered bombers across continents. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800, a masterpiece, made the Thunderbolt and Hellcat legends of durability. Later, when the P-51 Mustang received a liquid-cooled Packard-built Merlin engine, range and performance joined hands. Now, fighters escorted bombers deep into Germany, a technological tipping point. America didn't just build more airplanes, it built better ones, faster each month. Leadership and strategy, Roosevelt set the target. But generals and industrialists made it real. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of U.S. Army Air Forces, saw aviation not as support, but as a dominant arm of warfare. He pushed relentlessly for strategic bombing capability, long-range escorts, and pilot training pipelines to match production numbers. Industrial leaders: Henry Ford, William Knudsen of General Motors, Donald Douglas, Donald Nelson became generals of the factory floor, their battlegrounds, supply chains, tool shortages, and production quotas. The government learned to coordinate, not control. Contracts incentivized output. Factories received priorities for materials only if they delivered results. Mistakes were corrected ruthlessly. Inefficiencies were hunted like saboteurs, and yet, this was still a democracy. Workers could strike. Managers faced oversight. Newspapers scrutinized profits. Balancing speed with liberty was an unprecedented challenge, and a triumph. While Göring relied on intimidation and decree, America relied on coordination and scale. That difference, freedom fueling production rather than stifling it, became the silent weapon the Luftwaffe never anticipated. Leadership had set the course. Technology and people were catching up, but a crucial perspective remained: how the enemy viewed this change, and how air strategy itself was about to be rewritten by overwhelming numbers. The enemy's calculation from Berlin, early American ambitions looked laughable. Hermann Göring, architect of the Luftwaffe, believed air superiority was already settled history. His pilots returned from victories in France and the Balkans expecting triumph after triumph. Germany's aircraft factories had ramped up years earlier, and new models were constantly entering service. At first, Allied orders to the United States looked like desperation. British purchasing missions were treated like customers scrambling for lifelines. But as 1941 came, and British intelligence began tracking American factory expansions, concern replaced mockery. A telling moment arrived when German analysts realized the U.S. was not merely increasing output, it was building the infrastructure to multiply output again and again. Factories like Willow Run were designed for continuous expansion, their ceilings high enough for future tooling, their floors mapped for moving lines not yet running. The Luftwaffe faced a dilemma. They could not bomb American factories. They could not slow the Atlantic supply flow. They could not match American natural resources, and they were losing pilots faster than they could replace them. A crisis masked by early victories but destined to grow relentless. The longer the war lasted, the more the balance tilted. Time became America's ally and Germany's enemy. Tactical and operational transformation, a flood of aircraft is not just metal, it is capability. Before 1942, long-range bombers struggled without escorts. Fighter fuel tanks dried up far too soon. Luftwaffe interceptors savaged unprotected formations. Then came the breakthrough. Drop tanks extended the reach of American fighters. The P-51 Mustang arrived, fast, agile, deadly, and able to accompany bombers deep into the Reich. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators could now strike ball-bearing plants, oil refineries and rail yards, and return home. The U.S. Navy experienced a revolution of its own. Carrier aviation surged from a niche force to the decisive arm of Pacific warfare. Grumman fighters and Douglas dive bombers redefined naval engagements. Japan, once dominant, began bleeding aircraft and aviators at a rate it couldn't sustain. Numbers altered strategy. Losses became survivable. Innovation became iterative. Tactics evolved quickly because planes kept arriving. Quantity created freedom of action, and action shaped battlefield destiny. Moral, economic, and social impact total war blurred boundaries between factory and front. The government rationed rubber, gasoline, and meat. Victory gardens sprouted behind white picket fences. War bonds shaped paychecks. Everyone contributed, not always willingly, but with a growing awareness of shared fate. Labor disputes still erupted. Discrimination persisted. Urban overcrowding brought tension, but the collective mission had weight. For the first time since the Depression shattered confidence, people saw their work improve not only their own lives, but perhaps the world. Economically, the transformation was colossal. Unemployment vanished. Industrial wages rose sharply. Skilled labor expanded across demographics. The war effort accelerated social change. Women earned respect as skilled laborers. African American workers leveraged wartime necessity into post-war movements for equality. Technologies invented in haste, pressurized cabins, new alloys. Radar seeded post-war industries. Airplanes were no longer luxury curiosities. They were instruments of national survival. With every month, the consequences of American mobilization mounted until the shift from hope to dominance arrived. The moment Germany realized the balance had turned would be written in fire above Europe. And that moment brings us into the climax, where production met battlefield reality. By 1943, the skies over Europe had changed their tone. What once were confident Luftwaffe patrols now felt like defensive scrambles. German fighter wings were still formidable, but the math had begun to betray them. American factories surpassed. Roosevelt's original 50,000 plane target before the United States was even halfway through the war. Massive formations of bombers, dozens, then hundreds, crossed the Channel regularly. Their destination, the industrial sinews of the Third Reich. But the cost was brutal. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Kiel, Bremen, U-boat pens, aircraft plants, oil refineries. Targets crucial to German resistance. Early raids showed the stakes. Bombers without escorts could not reliably punch through. Luftwaffe fighters tore into the formations. Tail gunners fought desperately. Many crews never returned. The U.S. Army Air Forces faced a terrifying question. Could they afford the price of their own doctrine? Then a convergence occurred. Training pipelines filled. Radar navigation improved. Aircraft losses were replaced faster than they occurred. And the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang began escorting bombers deeper and deeper into danger. The strategy crystallized in February 1944. The code name, Operation Argument, better known as Big Week. For 6 relentless days, February 20th to 25th, American bombers and fighters launched strike after strike against Germany's aircraft production. Junkers assembly lines. Messerschmitt plants. Ball-bearing factories that kept engines spinning. The Luftwaffe responded with everything it had. Dogfights erupted over every target. Hundreds of contrails twisted into chaotic calligraphy. German aces racked up victories, but every one of their losses hurt more. There were no reserves waiting behind them. No fuel for extended training. No industrial breathing room. American squadrons, however, were backed by an ocean of production. If a Mustang fell in flames over Leipzig, 2 more rolled off the line in California by the time debris hit the ground. The psychological tables turned. German pilots began asking the same question their enemies once asked. How many more will they send? By the end of Big Week, Germany's aircraft industry was damaged, not destroyed. But something deeper had shifted. The Luftwaffe had been forced into a battle it could not sustain. Every experienced pilot lost now was irreplaceable. Every bomb that hit a factory slowed future output. Every escort fighter that survived brought Allied air superiority closer to inevitability. And behind every sortie statistic was one unstoppable truth. American production was no longer rising. It was surging. 85,198 aircraft produced. 1944, 96,318 aircraft produced. Just 2 years after Roosevelt's impossible claim, the United States was building almost 100,000 airplanes each year. Hermann Göring, once dismissive, now faced the consequences of his laughter. The skies he claimed belonged to Germany were being reclaimed by a nation he believed too soft to wage a mechanized war. But the climax was still unfolding. What happened next would define the rest of the conflict, on beaches, in forests, and across oceans. Because newly forged American might was about to strike where air dominance mattered most, directly in support of liberation. By mid-1944, The air war over Europe had transformed entirely. German fighter bases lay battered. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots were gone, replaced by youths rushed through training with minimal flight hours. Fuel shortages forced German aircraft to wait on the ground while Allied planes roamed with impunity. Air superiority wasn't a condition anymore. It was a weapon. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, that weapon unleashed its full power. Before Allied troops landed on Normandy's beaches, waves of C-47 transport aircraft carried paratroopers into the night. Bombers cratered rail lines, isolating the coast. Fighter bombers prowled roads, shredding any German armor daring to move toward the shore. American aircraft didn't just protect invasion forces. They shaped the battlefield itself. The Luftwaffe barely appeared. Those who dared rise into the skies were overwhelmed. This was not luck. It was the result of output. Every Thunderbolt overhead, every Mustang escort, every C-47 dropping soldiers had a backstory sealed in aluminum and factory grit. The arsenal of democracy had materialized into roaring engines and shimmering contrails that stretched across Europe. And as Allied soldiers pushed inland, strategic bombing continued, deeper and more devastating. Synthetic oil plants, Germany's lifeline, were hit repeatedly. Without fuel, panzers became steel tombs. Interceptors sat on runways, silent and useless. Truck convoys dried up. Supply lines snapped. The war Germany had started with speed, blitzkrieg, now slowed to a crawl. Machines once feared became monuments to logistical starvation. Meanwhile, across the globe, another war demanded these same skies. The Pacific, vast, unforgiving, and scattered across thousands of miles of ocean, became a proving ground for American naval aviation. Carrier decks that once hosted handfuls of fighters now teemed with Hellcats, Avengers, and Corsairs. Industrial might erase the fear of attrition. Naval task forces struck remote islands and returned in strength. Japanese pilots, like their German counterparts, became precious beyond replacement. The Mariana Islands campaign in mid-1944 provided a symbol. From bases like Saipan, vast formations of B-29 superfortresses, the most advanced bomber in the world soon roared toward the Japanese mainland. Factories that once built sedans now produced engines capable of crossing oceans. Air strategies that once felt theoretical now determined the fate of nations. Hermann Göring's laughter, once a symbol of German confidence, now echoed as bitter irony. He reportedly said later in the war that when he saw American fighters escorting bombers all the way to Berlin, he knew. The war is lost. He wasn't speaking of tactics. He was speaking of inevitability, because by 1944, American production wasn't merely meeting demands, it was exceeding them. Airplanes waited for crews. Airfields expanded weekly. Supply depots overfilled. War, once defined by scarcity, had become a contest of abundance, and abundance won. As 1945 approached, the consequences of overwhelming production were no longer felt only in dogfights or factory counts, but in the collapsing walls of the Axis powers themselves. The war's end was coming. Not quickly, not peacefully, but with a finality written in steel wings and the roar of engines built faster than any enemy could shoot them down. Soon, the gunfire would cease, and the world would look back on the numbers that made victory possible, leading us into the consequences of this industrial transformation. When the guns finally silenced in 1945, the world took stock of just how vast America's industrial surge had become. The numbers seemed unreal, more like economic myth-making than cold-fact 100,000-plus aircraft built during the war. Nearly 100,000 in 1944 alone. More planes than Germany and Japan combined could ever hope to field. This wasn't simply a victory of machines. It was a victory of systems, procurement, logistics, labor, and leadership aligned behind a singular goal: defeat fascism. The Luftwaffe, once feared and admired, was a shadow of itself. The attrition suffered in 1943 and 1944 had drained the well of pilot experience. Oil plants smoldered in ruins, ball-bearing output collapsed, and aircraft assembly lines slowed to a trickle. Flight cadets barely learned to handle their machines before being sent into combat. Many never returned. Germany's initial edge in air doctrine had evaporated under relentless pressure. Their best aces, men like Hartmann, Barkhorn and Rohl, could win individual engagements, but were powerless against arithmetic. Shoot down 3, lose 1 veteran, and the balance still worsened. And eventually, even the best pilots couldn't find enough fuel to fly. On the Allied side, the air armadas that once seemed desperate now appeared inevitable. Bomber Command and the USAF turned day and night into constant punishment for Nazi industry. Strategic oil shortages choked panzer divisions, grounded aircraft, and left mechanized warfare stuck in the mud. Training pipelines flooded the front with fresh crews. New aircraft rolled into units before mechanics had finished servicing the last batch. Replacement parts filled warehouses by the ton. The equation flipped, losses became numbers. Victories became momentum, and behind that momentum was home. Millions of workers returned to the headlines, not as names, but as statistics of output. Yet every C-47 that delivered paratroopers to Normandy, every P-51 that roared above Berlin, every B-29 that pushed the war across the Pacific, each owed its existence to someone who clocked in before dawn, tightened bolts through aching hands, and believed the outcome mattered. Roosevelt's once laughed-at promise of 50,000 planes had not just been fulfilled. It had been doubled. The world now understood. American industry, when mobilized, was a force that could not merely resist tyranny, it could overwhelm it. Yet while victory was celebrated, another question emerged. What would happen to this machinery of war now that peace had arrived? Factories hummed with engines designed for battle. Workers held skills rooted in urgency. The nation wielded unprecedented economic power. The war was ending. But America's transformation was only beginning. The sudden silence of peace carried a different kind of shock. In 1945, the United States stood as the only great power whose industrial base was not only intact, it was larger than ever before. Airfields stretched across the country. Machine tools filled factory floors. An army of workers stood ready for the next shift. Only there was no shift. The arsenal had to find a purpose beyond war. Many wartime plants shuttered, their enormous spaces locked away like monuments to urgency. But others pivoted with remarkable agility, military aircraft lines shifting to commercial aviation. The skills learned riveting bombers were now applied to crafting airliners. The DC-3, veteran of countless wartime flights, evolved into the aircraft that would democratize global travel. The workforce changed forever. Women who had proven their worth in the factories were expected to return home, yet many refused to surrender independence earned by necessity. African American workers, once confined to the lowest rungs of industry, held new leverage, having contributed mightily to the national fight. And they pushed harder for equality. Wartime mobility had eroded barriers that would continue falling in the decades ahead. Economically, the war's production boom ended the Great Depression in a way no policy ever could. America emerged financially dominant, holding most of the world's gold supply and producing half of all manufactured goods on Earth. The government discovered that strategic investment, especially in technology, could accelerate society, not just defend it. In terms of warfare, the lesson was unmistakable. Industrial power was as decisive as battlefield power. A new doctrine emerged in military planning, logistics not as support, but as strategy. The U.S. began investing in not just jets and bombers, but global infrastructure, air bases scattered across Europe, Asia, and the Pacific. The Cold War would be waged not by armies alone, but by fleets of aircraft standing ready to move at a moment's notice. For Germany, the memory of air superiority faded into a cautionary tale. Early dominance had nurtured overconfidence, industrial limitations, and the refusal to fully mobilize until too late doomed the Luftwaffe long before its aircraft fell from the sky. And Hermann Göring? The man who once laughed at American ambitions faced a trial not of mockery, but of justice. His confidence had distorted reality and underestimated a nation that turned manufacturing into a weapon. What began with disbelief ended in defeat. The ceilings of Willow Run, Boeing Plant 2, and Douglas assembly lines echoed empty now, but their legacy remained. American bombers had filled the skies. Fighters had swept aside tyranny. Engines built by uncounted hands had forced dictators to accept the kind of math they could not escape. 1,000 planes. That had been the dream. 100,000? That was the answer. Nation that once questioned whether it should enter the war now stood as the architect of victory and the world's dominant air power. The story of the arsenal of democracy was not just about who built the most. It was about who refused to believe that impossible was a fixed state. And that answer sets the stage for the final thought, what this transformation truly means, even now. There is a moment in every war where courage is measured not only in lives risked at the front, but in the decisions made far from gunfire. In 1940, when Roosevelt called for 50,000 planes, it was not a boast. It was a statement of faith, in workers still recovering from the Depression, in factories not yet built, in a nation not yet committed to battle. Faith, backed by action, is a powerful force. American workers turned proposals into propellers, blueprints into bomb bays, and raw ore into wings strong enough to carry democracy across oceans. Their labor shortened the war. Their precision saved lives. Their speed overwhelmed an enemy who believed industry could be outflown and outfought. Hermann Göring once mocked the idea that Americans could build a fleet big enough to matter. Years later, watching Allied bombers and fighters dominate German skies, he understood too late what the world would never forget. Do not underestimate a free society when it chooses to defend itself. History often remembers war in images, a beach at Normandy, a flag over Iwo Jima, a city in ruins. But behind each image lies the unseen. The worker in overalls, the engineer at a drafting table, the welder beneath a wing. The quiet victories that make the loud ones possible. When the war ended, many of those aircraft never flew again. They sat in desert boneyards under blazing sunlight, their missions complete, their engines retired. But the real legacy of those 100,000 planes did not rust away. It rose into a new global order, one shaped by American air power, technological ambition, and industrial confidence. The arsenal of democracy proved something that still resonates. Strength does not come from war, but from the willingness to rise when challenged. Roosevelt's voice in 1940 was not predicting the future. It was daring America to build it, and in answer, a nation that once doubted its role in the world stepped forward, wings first, and changed history forever.